Right, hello. I'm trying something different because I left my visualizer at school, which is irritating. So I'm going to have a go at recording it on the computer. I'm basically just using screen share and we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to have to type it because I thought that would make more sense than me trying to write on my iPad because actually it's really hard to read my writing on the iPad. So we'll see how this goes. If this is terrible, then hopefully, I won't have to do it again because I'll remember to bring my visualizer home. So I'm going to cover sections 9 to 12 on the skeleton notes for the 1945 election, just so that this section of the course doesn't take ages because I think I've honestly massively overplanned it. But that's okay because the 1945 election would be a lovely exam question to come up in the exam. So, where we need to start then is the disconnection, as I've worded it, between Westminster / the Conservative government or the Conservatives in the coalition and the general people and sort of public sentiment, but also the specific timing of the election in July 1945. So, because Churchill is Prime Minister, so he's PM, but he's also Minister for War, this means his focus is primarily on the war effort and not domestic policy. So that means that Churchill's awareness of public sentiment is limited because he's locked away in his map rooms, etc., etc. So because Churchill's primarily focused on the war effort, military strategy, military technique, etc., etc., he is sort of isolated or insulated. I really liked this word. I stole this from that lecture that I was talking about in class the other day. He is particularly insulated from the shifting public sentiment. And we've already spoken about the fact that by 1943, Labour are 38% approval in the polls, whereas Tories are 31% approval. So that's a drop of just around 20%. So the Conservatives really aren't, I suppose, holding it together potentially as well as they might have thought they could during the war effort. Now, because I've sort of worded it here, the coalition's wartime mandate had ended. Because we've got VE Day in May 1945, Germany has surrendered, which means that the war in Europe is over. The coalition government has lost its mandate to be in charge of Britain. So what needs to happen now in order for the coalition government to survive post-war is it needs to win an election. And the main reason for that is because it's been 10 years since the last election, which was in 1935. So in order for the coalition government to stay in power, it needs to win another election to give it that mandate to run the country. So this is very much reminiscent of the 1918 election, or the coupon election, where the David Lloyd George coalition government won and existed post-war. So we're seeing a push here from the Conservatives, especially Churchill, who's very pro coalition government. He's got this weird love affair almost with certain members of the Labour Party, especially Ernst Bevin. They're like Bezzy mates, which I love. Well, do I love it? No, I suppose that's not true. But I just find it kind of funny that you've got the pompous silver spoon of Churchill versus Ernst Bevin, salt of the earth trade unionist. I just find that, I don't know, it's kind of Romeo and Juliet-esque, potentially. Anyway, so like I've just said, Churchill has a particular respect for Bevan, Morrison and Dalton. And obviously you'll remember that Morrison is Home Sec, Hugh Dalton is about to be Chancellor, and Bevan is Minister for Labour. Labour in this context meaning workers, not the Labour Party. And what Churchill wants to do is get the support of key Labour leaders, Morrison, Dalton, Bevan, etc., etc., and continue the coalition post-war. But the problem is the rank and file, so the ordinary members of the Labour Party really don't want that. The ordinary Labour Party members want to vote on whether the coalition is maintained post-war. And what ends up happening is the idea of a post-war coalition is proposed at the Labour Party conference, and it's rejected. The Labour Party want to fight the election as an independent party, not as part of the coalition. So this is quite a defeat, really, for Churchill in particular, who is actually gutted that he's not going to be working with some of his best mates or some of the people that he's become particularly close to, like Bevan. Bevan is the big one that Churchill's gutted that he is not going to be working with anymore. To the point where Churchill's basically saying that it's a complete disgrace that they won't be working together, and I'm trying to remember the exact wording of what he says. I think he says something along the lines of, we must hope for a reunion when party feeling is less strong, which is basically Churchill saying that once Labour have sort of gotten over themselves or have cooled down, there might be the possibility of further coalition or further cooperation. Obviously that doesn't happen, but this is interesting because it shows us the depths of Churchill's respect for several key members of the Labour Party or the Labour cabinet members. Sorry if I sound really monotone and bored. I don't mean to. I just keep hearing my own voice and I'm like droning. I don't mean to. It's just because I'm tired. I actually am finding this really interesting. I like this part of the course. So if I sound bored, it's not. I don't mean to. I'm just very tired. So basically where we've got to now, if you were to like plot this out on a timeline, the election's called. It's gonna happen in early July 1945. Churchill doesn't really have a great understanding of public sentiment because he's been very isolated during the war. He doesn't have really like a cohesive understanding of the extent to which public sentiment has swung away from the Conservative Party. He's realised that the coalition needs a mandate in order to continue because it's been 10 years since the last election. What he wants, he being Churchill, what Churchill wants is for the coalition to be maintained post-war because he bloody loves Bevan. But because the ordinary Labour Party members vote against maintaining the coalition post-war, the Labour Party is going to fight the election as the independent Labour Party. They're not going to fight as like coalition Labour. So this means that Clement Attlee will be going toe-to-toe with Winston Churchill for the head job, for, you know, boss of the UK, if you like. So, now that Labour have decided that they want to run as an independent party separate from the Conservative Party / they don't want any sort of part in the coalition, we've got a significant challenge to Attlee's leadership. So obviously we remember that Attlee has been leader of the Labour Party since 1935. And we've got a guy called Harold Laski. And Harold Laski is the chairman of the National Executive of the Labour Party. So you can just refer to him as Labour chairman. And basically what he says to Attlee is that there's widespread feeling that Attlee should resign. And that if Attlee resigned, that's how Labour are going to win the election. So Attlee's resignation is crucial Attlee's resignation is seen as crucial to victory in the 1945 election. So Harold Laski is very much not a fan of Attlee's style of leadership, and remember that quite a few people in Labour don't find Attlee charismatic enough to sort of take the Labour Party through a general election. But Attlee actually responds to this in the most brilliant way imaginable, because basically what Attlee says is, thank you for your letter, because he's written this in a private letter to Attlee himself. So he's written his boss and basically gone, yeah, I think you should resign. And Attlee replies to this by going, thank you for your letter, the contents of which have been noted. So he's basically like, yeah, okay, I have read your letter and I'm going to do absolutely nothing about it. So Attlee here is sassy. Maybe we're not going to write sassy. I'm trying to think of a better word than sassy. I can't think of the word. What's a word to describe Attlee's behaviour? It's almost quite like a witty... What is happening now? Why is it doing that? That's so weird. It stopped me from typing then. Attlee's got a very witty response here, and it highlights the fact that he's actually a very intelligent man who isn't afraid of meeting criticism. So, obviously, Attlee doesn't resign. And Attlee is taking the Labour Party through its election campaign. And we see this sort of clever version of Attlee, this sort of witty version of Attlee coming out again when he is facing some pretty significant accusations from Churchill of basically wanting to start a British version of the Gestapo. Now, what I thought was also worth noting is this. So, Labour in the 1940s are kingmakers, basically. And they do that twice. Because Labour are the ones that boot out Chamberlain, because they refuse to be in a coalition with him. Labour are the ones that bring in Churchill, because they will work with Churchill because of their anti-appeasement, proactive attitude to military policy. And then Labour are the ones that then refuse to work with Churchill post-war and end up being the reason that Churchill loses. Does that say loses or loses? I can't remember how to spell loses. But basically, the Labour Party are really important in the 1940s, and they actually dictate quite a lot of key decisions about country leadership. So this just highlights the importance of the Labour Party and the level of their influence over British politics. So I thought this is a really interesting point, an important point for you to remember, that Labour really are the kingmakers. They are the ones that bring they are the ones that boot Chamberlain out because of appeasement. They're the ones that allow Churchill to rise to power because they'll work with him in the coalition. But ultimately, it's their refusal to work with Churchill in the coalition post-war that sort of secures them the victory in their own right. So, Churchill resigns in May 1945, and he's asked to basically form a caretaker government by the king to oversee politics during the election. So the caretaker government is like a stopgap between the coalition and the victorious government of July 1945. So from now, this is the end of the wartime coalition. Churchill's coalition, or Churchill's wartime coalition, exists from May 1940 to May 1945. So it literally lasts 4 or 5 years. And it's interesting that it's called a caretaker government because Churchill literally talks about it. The purpose of this government being to take very good care of Britain in the sort of, I don't know how to word it, in the like period of uncertainty before, that is not, oh, I did spell it right, before the July 1945 election. And whilst Churchill is the leader of this caretaker government, he begins his campaign by making some quite controversial statements, let's say. So, one of the key things that Churchill says is that he basically goes really hard on how socialism is a potential threat to British democracy. So, despite the fact he has just worked with, out and proud, uncloseted socialists for the past 5 years, he's now getting on his soapbox and saying, socialist policy is a danger, it's a threat to British democracy. And he literally says that socialist policy is abhorrent to the British ideas of freedom. And he says that, so this is in one of his election campaign speeches, and he says that you can't have socialism without totalitarianism. And he says that the European totalitarian regimes, so you're talking Stalin, well, I suppose Stalin not European, but still the global totalitarian regimes, you're talking Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, were informed by socialist ideals, which isn't true anyway, but they were informed by socialist ideals. So if Britain introduces socialism, Britain will end up like Germany in the late 1930s, early 1940s. So remember, totalitarianism is the idea that every single aspect of society and every single aspect of human life within that country is dictated to you by the government. And then Churchill makes the clumsy sort of reference to the Gestapo. And he basically says that in order to enact socialist policy and in order to introduce socialism to Britain, Labour would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo. So he's basically accusing the Labour Party of using a militia to enforce their beliefs. So he's basically accusing them of potentially turning mid-1940s Britain into late 1930s Germany. This is oh gosh, what's happened there? This is incredibly controversial because of the fact that, we're in late May, early July 1945. there is a much broader awareness now of the consequences of German aggression and the totalitarian regime in Germany. And we as like a global community have a more in-depth understanding of the consequences of that, i.e. like murder, the Holocaust, the execution of political prisoners, war crimes, etc., etc. So to say that the Labour Party are going to create their own version of the Gestapo is a hell of an accusation. So what Labour does is actually quite clever, because Labour doesn't react to the accusation of having a Gestapo with, like, they don't get massively defensive over it. Attlee manages this incredibly well. So Attlee doesn't, I don't know how to word it. What's the word I'm looking for? Doesn't retaliate to the Gestapo speech. And he comes across as looking mature, honourable, intelligent. And Attlee makes a big deal about post-war reconstruction. The implementation of the Beveridge report, maintenance. What spelling that was? We'll just go with maintaining instead of maintenance, because my spelling was so bad it couldn't tell what I was trying to say. And I spelled honourable like Americans. Oh my lord. Anyway, maintaining things like full employment, etc., etc. So instead of scaremongering, the Labour Party have a hopeful campaign, which is literally seen in their campaign slogan, "Let us face the future." It's a very hopeful, forward-facing campaign, which is very different to how Churchill's running the campaign, by just trying to smear Labour's reputation. Yeah, I've already talked about this. So because the Labour Party were in an interesting position in the wartime coalition, they were in government so could take credit for successes, i.e. in domestic policy. So we've talked about things like infant mortality, a reduction in the rates of rickets and nutrition and stuff like that. So the Labour Party could take credit for that, but they could blame any failures on the Conservative government, or on people like Churchill or Eden. Because remember, Eden is his foreign secretary. So this is a really unique, advantageous position to be in. Because it sort of makes the Labour Party look like it hasn't actually had any failures. Because any failures that they might have had can just be blamed on the Conservatives. Right, we'll leave it there. Don't worry too much about this stuff. This is just interesting little extras. The Churchill's daughter one, where she goes really hard on her dad about going, well, actually, all the socialist policies introduced by the Labour government during the war were really good and people liked them, so why are you criticising them? And this part is really important. All of Churchill's speeches look ridiculous, because if he genuinely was threatened by the Labour Party, why the hell did he work with them for 5 years? And why is he desperate to maintain a coalition with them after the war? And why is he writing to Ernst Beving going, maybe once everything's cooled down, we can come back together again? So, did he really believe Labour to be totalitarian demons? Absolutely not. Right, when I see you in person, we'll be able to finish this off. In hindsight, I've gone too much in depth with this, but you live and you learn. We'll look at sort of the fallout of the election, and we'll think in more detail about 3 sort of myths, I guess, as to why Labour won. And yeah, so hopefully this worked. I did do a test to see if I had turned on my microphone, and I had, but no, my luck, it won't have worked. But yeah, I will see you at some point next week.